It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day listeners, and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 159, recorded on the 4th of June 2026. Joining me as usual is Hong Kong Jack. G'day mate, how are you?
Pretty well.
Yeah, well, today's episode we're going to have a look at a bit of news, political news around Australia, and have a bit of a peek at the UK. But as discussed in our last podcast, we're going to have a look at the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and where mistakes were made, and follows the sort of comments that I made last week, that we really haven't properly understood what we've been through, and we sort of, governments and communities just sort of parked COVID in 2023, and we sort of moved on with a bit of a hangover, but not really understanding why. So hopefully we'll crack that problem today. Jack, Redbridge Poll in the AFR showing One Nation at 31%, Labor 28%, LNP 20%, and the Greens 12%.
And a measure of the change that's come over Australian politics. They did the two-party preferred, and they didn't do it the coalition against Labor. That was done One Nation and Labor.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the coalition. Of course, we're dealing with polling, and the real markers are going to be when there's an election. There's going to be one in Victoria later this year, and then one in New South Wales early next. And that's when we'll have a better handle on these things. What we've seen is the South Australian election and a by-election in Farrah with no Labor candidate. But overall, Jack, I think certainly the government is aware of these issues, and the LNP will be as well, the coalition will be as well. And, in the sort of nightmare scenarios, we're talking about basically every National Party seat being conceded to One Nation,
Yep.
As well as Labor regional seats and rural seats going to One Nation, and that leading to a sort of minority government with Albanese being able to govern with the support of crossbenchers like the Teals. Just not based on polling. This is what we're looking at. So the National Party could simply disappear at the next federal election.
Yes, I think we've moved past this could just be a protest vote, a rehash of Pauline Hanson's quick rise up the political ladder in Queensland and even quicker fall to, no, this is probably real. The experience in South Australia and in Farrah and stuff suggests this is actually real.
Yeah, I think there's still a very strong protest vote element, Jack, but protest votes can be expressed not just in polling but at the ballot box. And I think that's what it is, that Australians, or many Australians, are tired of pluralism, Jack. It's the sort of thing that's kept our democracy in pretty good shape for the last 125 years.
Well, I actually think they're just tired of the two big political groupings. I think that's it in a nutshell.
But of course, if One Nation succeeds, the very likely outcome is Labor wins.
Probably, yes.
And so let's get to, well, we've just mentioned the National Party. They could simply just disappear as a party without representation in the states and federally as well. In Victoria, we'll see this manifest, but Victoria's always been a bit shaky for the Nats anyway. There's almost always independents running against Nats in regional Victoria. Steve Brack's minority government. was allowed to was allowed to take place because of rural independents taking National Party seats. So the Nats have had this sort of problem in Victoria before.
And third parties who are sort of anti one party sometimes elect the other party. So, the DLP really existed as an anti-Labor party, right? But it kept the Liberal coalition in power for election after election after election.
Yeah.
And it's possible that the One Nation group might keep, its avowed enemy in power again.
But it is an opposition party, isn't it? I mean, it really isn't fit to govern in any particular way. Is it likely that with this, with these high polling numbers, that there will be additional scrutiny placed on One Nation, Jack? I saw Barnaby Joyce was in support of abortion law reform in New South Wales, coming out supporting the Libertarian upper house member who's seeking to put a private members bill through on restricting abortion in terms of sex identification.
Which is, I wouldn't call that abortion law reform. That's a reform to one small aspect of abortion.
Yeah, but it opens up. It opens up these sorts of issues. I mean, if One Nation are going to try and get support of women, etc., and then they get some hard questions asked of them around reproductive law. Then these things start to splinter away. I mean, if you look at the One Nation website, I don't know how many people have. Policies are in 2-sentence fragments and that sort of thing. There's no detail there. So when questions start being asked of them in particular policy areas, and we sort of get answers that are either highly controversial and not accepted by the mainstream, by mainstream Australians, or indeed you find that they splinter, have a number of different opinions coming across, and those things are going to cause some problems, aren't they? I mean, if we look at Hanson, she's not a disciplined politician. I did notice that the Australian ran and other newspapers ran, her parliamentary attendance record, and it's as poor as you could possibly imagine. But that stuff's not going to affect her support so much. But I think once there's a proper analysis of One Nation policies, which is, as I say, as expressed on their website, are really just a bunch of motherhood statements. Surely with scrutiny, there'll be some problems arise.
If I were the mainstream parties, I wouldn't be relying on that. I mean, one of the reasons why, not just Pauline Hanson, but reform in the UK and Donald Trump in the US succeed, is because they're prepared to talk about the third rail things, the things that nobody else wants to talk about because polite society doesn't talk about them. The voters are not flocking to One Nation.
Culture war stuff, like, welcome to country and all this sort of stuff. How many flags should a politician stand in front of?
Immigration. In all three of those countries, the party who was prepared to speak about immigration is now, either in the case of the United States became the government, or in the case of reform in One Nation, well on the way there. I mean, I personally think that the major parties have got to be prepared to talk about the things that One Nation talks about, that we've told ourselves polite people don't talk about that.
Not easy when they exaggerate. Not easy when they exaggerate, Jack. I mean, basically we had Angus Taylor come out and use exaggerated figures on Australia's migration rates year to date during the week. Sort of misleading stuff there. So not easy to come up with a defence if you're coming up against people who are deliberately misleading.
I'm not saying they've got to agree with one nation. What I'm saying is they've got to be prepared to talk about all these issues. Just
no, what I'm saying is,
have
Jack,
a look at the
you
things.
You can't defend something that doesn't exist. You can't respond to essentially a lie, and that's the problem. If someone says to you, "Listen, we're going to have a talk about migration or immigration in Australia," and said, "Well, you know." It's a bit like saying, well, you know, we can talk about a whale, and say, well, we want to talk about migration, while someone else is talking about something else. It's almost impossible to defend.
Well, I don't see it as defending anything. I think they've just got to be prepared to discuss this stuff, and historically, we haven't. Neither of the major political parties are prepared to touch some of these issues, and I think they have to.
Let's look at migration. Let's push migration to one side. We did see the freshly elected member for Farrah. He likes to stand in front of three flags to Pauline Hanson's chagrin, but she's allowed that to happen. I mean, when push comes to shove, when people march into a polling booth, they're not going to be bothered about these things, are they? How many flags politicians stand in front of? Doesn't have any impact on their lives.
What they're going to be mindful of is if they feel that some part of the political process won't even discuss these things or listen to them, they feel unheard, is what I believe. And while they feel unheard, they will vote against the people who they think are sneering at them and snobbing them.
If they feel unheard, yeah, I understand that, Jack, but people vote with a sense of what's good for themselves and what's good for the country, a combination of those two things. But when we get into this sort of culture war stuff, what we've found in the last three elections at least is that this stuff doesn't matter.
I think with One Nation's numbers, you've got to start rethinking that.
So what should you do? Engage in culture wars?
No, well, you've got to engage in the things that people think are important, and at the moment they don't.
Who drives what's important, Jack?
The 28% who say they'll vote One Nation. That's who drives what's important.
No. Who drives what's important is the media, essentially. So these are the things that come up in Sky News and other places on social media and so forth. I mean, why would the government come out and justify why Anthony Albanese and his other ministers stand in front of three Australian flags?
Well, I think if he doesn't engage in the conversation, he will lose people to One Nation. Because I think that, it's not.
It's meaningless, Jack. What I'm telling you, these things are trivial, and they are not voting determinants. I mean, you should know this. You should know this when it comes to voting determinants. The economy and people's household economies are a major factor. Migration may well be a major factor in voting determinants going forward. Environment, climate change responses, those sorts of things are significant. But when we get to these culture war things, Jack, they don't amount to a hill of beans. They really just don't. People don't vote on these silly matters, on these trivial matters.
I think the polling shows that the One Nation voters just might.
Well, I'm not sure that we've seen anything really in South Australia. When we look at South Australia as a state election, what did we get there? What were the numbers in how many One Nation lower house MPs are there?
Yeah, the number of votes was quite impressive. The number of seats, no.
Yeah. So what we may be looking at is. And I think a lot of people are, framing this as a Labor losing support, and there may be a sort of an element of that. It's not substantial, really. There's been a poorly received budget, which has, I think, impacted on their numbers. But if we look at this realistically, what we are looking at is a major splinter to the right-wing vote, a la Labor and the DLs going back to the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
And that's what it will do. And perhaps if right-wing voters, people who tend to vote either for the coalition or might vote for One Nation or some of the right-wing other parties, they might reconsider their vote if they come to a belief that their vote is essentially going to deliver Labor into government with perhaps even greater majorities.
They might, and Labor may well be the beneficiary of this, but I don't think it's going to go away.
I don't think it's going to go away until this right-wing vote splinters at a federal election, and then then it will become apparent, one, that One Nation support will deliver Labor governments, and two, One Nation is simply not capable of being in opposition. And then when they have perhaps a dozen, possibly 20 seats in the lower house, and following on from the polling, that's what they're sort of looking at. Then you'll start finding the personalities rubbing each other the wrong way, and you have splinters. This is the way minor parties have gone in Australia for a long time. We just haven't seen perhaps the levels of support in polling that we have that in the past. So people have been offered alternatives to vote, but not by this sort of stonking margin. What percentage of the first preference votes did they get in South Australia? Do you remember?
No, I don't.
I think it's around 20%. But as I say, didn't get much for it. And then they've got to deal with they've got a few in the upper house. So I'm not looking at the right part, but my memory of it was a sort of low 20s. And I think again what it did was essentially wipe the Liberal Party off the face of the map, essentially essentially driving it into minor party status. No real significant national party or nothing in South Australia for the Nationals there. But yeah, I mean, do people understand that their support of One Nation is going to deliver, more likely than not, is going to deliver a Labor government with significant majorities in the lower house?
Well, history tells you that people will still vote the way they want to. We've already discussed the DLP keeping Labor out of power, despite them being a real Labor party for decades. Look at the what was I thinking of the other day? Oh, the Republic Referendum. Easy to get a majority to have a new head of state, but impossible to get a single model up because it's split, because the country split three ways, and the two groups who were pro-Republican understand and understood at the time of the last referendum that by voting the way they did, they would scupper any chance of there being a republic, but they still voted for their choice of the model rather than say, well, okay, we'll bury our differences and go that way. So, I mean, it's always possible. What else is possible is that the parties of the right in Australia come to some arrangement and find some way of pooling their interests. That's a possibility. Unlikely, but it could happen.
Yeah, that is something to think about, and clearly there is, some driving force. Tony Abbott, of course, recently chosen as the president of the Liberal Party. He said, well, we're not going to criticise Pauline Hanson. So in the end, I think is perhaps not the way to go. It's basically fight or die for them. And I just think if they're going to be sort of One Nation light, there'll be no success there. They've chosen almost deliberately to avoid the centre.
Even in the UK, this battle's going on. There are I would think, plenty of people in the Liberal Party who would say we must fight them, but we also need to accommodate them, and that's going on in the Tory party. I can tell you there's some significant people in the Tory party in the UK who are saying we need to reach, we should fight them like we fight factions within our own party, but we should come to some kind of accommodation with them. And there will be people in the Australian Liberal Party who will think that. Tony Abbott would be one of them, I would think.
Well, this is what I'm looking at. When we talk about the demise of the Liberal Party or the demise of the coalition, but the Liberal Party in particular, I've said this many, many times, they chose to ignore their constituency. They got rolled in some of their safest seats by teal candidates, teal independent candidates, and rather than learn from that, they decided to go and find a new constituency that to this day remains lost to them. You know, they really are a party struggling for a constituency.
Well, both the major parties abandoned their traditional constituency. Labor was luckier. They found a new one. I mean, Labor hasn't really been the party of the working class for a long time because it abandoned them, but it found a new constituency, and Cos Samaras and Redbridge point all that out in their polling.
Well, who's working class in this country these days, Jack?
Well, Cos Samaras says the working class of the tradies, etc., in the outer suburbs, and I think that's probably still right. And he says that Labor's constituency now, the Labor voting bloc, is inner and middle metropolitan voters, largely public service in the caring community, etc., etc.
I like this from Imre Salasinski, a former writer for The Australian, and he's been a Liberal Party apparatchik for a fairly long time. Imre, lovely fellow. He said, we're now officially in another Joe for Canberra bubble. Again, for those who go back to those days, Joe Bjelke-Petersen announced himself as a potential Prime Minister and essentially just split the Liberal vote and allowed Bob Hawke to win an election comfortably.
Yeah,
87 from memory.
Yeah, it did take off. It's when I read that from Imre, I had to go, oh, gee, it did. I mean, I'd kind of forgotten just how big the Joe for Canberra thing was for a fleeting moment. This One Nation thing, I think's already
it's sustained longer than that.
Yeah, but much. I mean, the Joe for Canberra thing was the thing of months. Months. No, that's quite true.
You know, my history doesn't repeat. Certainly not in a precise way.
But I did chuckle at the Imre.
It's got a bit to do. I remember some bugger at my cricket club put a Joe for PM sticker on my car. And I was blithely unaware of it for a number of weeks, and they had a good old giggle when I finally did find it on the bumper bar. Yeah, look, I'm not quite sure.
People still have bumper stickers these days?
Yeah, they do.
In Australia?
Not so much the adhesive kind. I think unless you drive a pretty old crappy car, you'll tend to find that you've got your magnets and things like that now.
Okay. So on my battered Renault, I had the John Cain for Victoria stickers and all that sort of stuff. And I've got to tell you, these were very handy because I discovered that looking a bit like a inner urban Labor person and having the battered old car with the John Cain stickers on it, I could just drive in and park at Parliament House whenever I wanted to. This
guy talks the talk.
Even if I was going to the MCG on a Saturday, I could park in there and walk across the park. Very handy.
Alrighty. Yeah. Look, just to round all this off, I'm not convinced. I think my best guess is at the next federal election we will see One Nation with somewhere between, let's say, 18 and 25% of the primary vote. I know that's a big gap, but I think that's where it will come, and it will come almost always from the LNP vote, and perhaps from some of the other parties. what we might see in Victoria is a higher rate of one nation vote, particularly in safe Labor seats. I think that might be a given. But I think the Victorian state election is quite peculiar in that you've got this a government that has clearly had too much time in government. Or this party has had too much time in government, the Labor Party, and concerns about whether the Liberal Party has what it takes to govern the state. There is still a strong chance that Labor could be re-elected, given the sheer number of seats that an opposition has to win to form government. And if that vote is splintering, then it might just be that Labor come through. I would think that would be a really poor outcome for Victoria, by the way. These things can happen. We'll get some sort of really shocking sort of election results. Hanson, it must be said, Jack, did announce that she was ready to govern. Yeah. How does she do that from the Senate, Jack?
Yeah.
Should she put a name on a ballot in, let's say, a Queensland National Party held seat, like, well, perhaps not Maranoa, which is the safest one, but should she be doing that, having a tilt in the lower house?
She'd want to be sure the numbers were there, and you have to turn up and do more work in the lower house. As to the state elections, I don't think I would read too much into what happens in the state elections into the next federal election.
I think Victoria is going to be quite unique and very chaotic. I think New South Wales will give us a better idea of where we are.
Well, the South Australian one gave us some idea that there was more to one nation than we thought. But this was a very popular Labor government, so that was always going to. They were never going to sweep anyone aside in South Australia because Malinauskas is very popular. And I wouldn't think I would rely too much on what happens in Victoria.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think we're going to see some rather odd results in Victoria, driven by specific. Yeah, 22.9% of the vote in South Australia. Just to follow up on that. All right.
As to whether what she can do from the upper house. There is one precedent of a prime minister being appointed from the upper house. John Gorton was still a senator. Was still a senator when he became prime minister. And I can't remember my constitutional laws.
Which seat they eased him into?
Into Kooyong, I think.
But then again, Jack, you are looking at the sort of chaos that only Billy McMahon could have caused, Jack. I mean, it's hard to find a more loathed politician. Many of our listeners fortunately weren't alive when he was Prime Minister of Australia, but just he hated his own party more than he hated Labor. And so, yes, it led to Gorton. And well, Gorton actually resigned, didn't he? Voted against himself famously in a split spill in the party room.
Yeah, exercised the casting vote against himself, which you probably should have, yeah.
Yeah, you probably should have when you're in that situation. Yeah, agreed. All right, tell us what's going on in the UK, Jack. We did have the Mandelson document dump earlier this week. What did it show there? It seems to show, you can confirm this if you like, it seemed to show that number 10 is dysfunctional, not necessarily Sir Keir Starmer, but his office is dysfunctional. That was certainly the view of Peter Mandelson, Lord Peter Mandelson. But what else was in there, Jack?
A couple of things I thought were interesting. There were a lot of commentary from his ministers, and they didn't see Keir Starmer as being a very significant figure in the government at all. There was no sense of, well, this is what the Prime Minister wants. None of them seemed to know what the Prime Minister wants. There was absolutely zero respect or fear of the authority of the Prime Minister. So he's just kind of an empty suit. That was my takeaway from it. But one thing that really stuck out for me, and this is going to haunt Labor for a while, we were talking last week about I think I said I thought the Parliamentary Labor Party was to the left of the community, and the membership was even further to the left of them. One of their better ministers, McFadden, was talking to Anderson, and his text read, "Every meeting I have with Labor MPs, it's all about who can we tax in order to pay benefit to other people." And
yeah, and people who simply what it showed me that was a lot of sort of comment about, you know, the plethora of Labor MPs, backbench MPs. You know, what can we tax so I can look after my vested interest in my electorate, that sort of thing. And it just shows what, you know, one of the shortcomings of having a stonking majority. You get a lot of people elected who have no idea how government works or should work. And that was apparent to me. A lot of some stuff was withheld because Mandelson is, of course, under police investigation. Yeah. What's likely to happen to him, Jack?
Well, I think it's probable that he will get charged with something.
Misconduct in public office or something related to it, yeah. And
I mean, it sort of depends what they turn up. I mean, really, if it's real bribery and corruption, you know, on behalf of, you know, foreign interests, say, that would be serious. But if it's just misconduct in public office, you know, I don't think anyone's going to take it very seriously.
Most amusing during the week, Jack, there was a BBC interview with Nicola Sturgeon, whose estranged husband has now pleaded guilty to corruptly obtaining approximately 400,000 quid's worth of SNP donations and buying himself a rather odd shopping list of things, Jack. And Nicola Sturgeon, who apparently very hardworking in St Andrew's House most of the time. That's where the Scotland's First Minister sits. But it's an extraordinary case, Jack. The first thing I thought, I mean, it's all extremely funny. He bought, I think, 6 high-end coffee machines when you'd reckon the kitchen bench is probably a bit full for just the one. 7 Dyson vacuums, 7 Dyson vacuum cleaners, a salt and pepper shaker's worth $4,000, 2,000 quid.
And for those listeners who are going shopping, they are Lalique. Is the brand.
Well, you reckon Nicola might have gone, we haven't got the old plastic Saxosalt shakers out. We've got these things that looks like they were made in Vegas for Liberace. So, of course, you know, she can't. She has been cleared of any wrongdoing by Police Scotland. But it just seems rather odd that she just, when she was stumbling up the driveway at 2:00 in the morning after a long day at work, said, there's a brand new car there. Of course, and that was an iJag, and I think he funded a purchase of a part of a Volkswagen as well.
And he bought a motorhome, which was...
And the motorhome is the key, of course,
parked at his parents' place, which he only put 4 miles on the...
only 4 miles on the clock, parked it at his mum's house, who's 92 years of age, Jack. Yeah. So she's obviously not going to do the grey nomad thing, probably a bit old for that. Very strange stuff indeed. Of course, you know, under the British legal system, of course, she was cleared, as I say, but she can't be charged for the crimes of her now ex-husband.
She could have been charged if they thought that they could.
She was arrested. She was arrested and interviewed. Yeah,
but if they thought she could get a conviction, and she maintains the interview on the BBC. It wasn't quite Prince Andrew, but it wasn't much better.
Brilliant interviewer. She's a brilliant interviewer, by the way. And can
Laura
just
Kunzberg, wasn't it?
Yeah,
Laura Kunzberg. Yeah,
that's right. Sorry, yes, I got the name wrong, but she's a brilliant interviewer. Yeah, and she just draws out sort of confessions from people.
Yeah, this was a hopeless performance from Sturgeon, but she didn't have much to work with. As you said, she said she didn't go in the kitchen much, so she didn't notice the 6 coffee machines. But of course, there are
about the 7 Dysons just running across and there was a robot lawnmower too. She might have peered up and had a look at that. I did take a look at the marital home in Glasgow. There's a bit of lawn there to be cut. It looked very trimmed and very nice, by the way. An extraordinary thing. What's he looking at in terms of a jail term? Man of his age?
Idea. I don't know what.
Got to go away, doesn't he? He's got to get a holiday.
I think he'll get a custodial, but because it's $400,000, it's £1. It's quite a lot.
And
that's
of money. That's what he's pled guilty to. But there's 600,000 quid missing, and so he might have
this of course was
in
not
a couple more salt and pepper shakers.
This of course was not taxpayer money. This is money.
This is donation money.
This is money from his political party that he was the director of.
And it was money particularly ring-fenced for a sort of crack at a second independence referendum.
Well, some of it was, and how that all works is still a bit unclear. So, yeah,
I believe most of it was small donations, and driven by the SNP's. Sort of on again, off again discussions of having another Scottish independence referendum. Extraordinary stuff, and yes, he will. Peter
Murrell.
He will almost certainly get a custodial sentence, you would think. And the marriage, they separated, I think, within hours of him being charged with embezzlement. He was using fake invoices in many cases, and in others, he was just claiming expenses, claiming these rather odd expenses. The first, I didn't talk about this in the article that I wrote for the Oz Today, but when he's acquiring all these high-end goods, there were pens, Mont Blanc pens and Swiss watches and things like that. It almost looked like an attempt at money laundering, Jack. He was going to put it on Facebook Marketplace or something like that. Why was he buying all this gear?
Well, why was he buying, say, multiple watches on the same day? It was very odd.
Well, it seemed to me to be an attempt at money laundering, but a pretty poor one at that, if that was the case, because if he's buying this kit and then, hocking it somewhere and then taking the cash, which I thought that must be the reason, either that or he's, a conspicuous consumer. Very strange, very strange. It looked like he was trying to buy a bunch of gear and then sell it on the quiet a bit later on.
Could be.
The estranged couple, Nicola Sturgeon, First Minister of Scotland for a decade, and a political force. I mean, she just leaves office now. Not leaves office, she's left office, but her reputation is completely trashed.
Yes, it was damaged by the Alex Salmond trial and her behaviour in that. He ended up coming out of Alex Salmond, ended up coming out of that okay, and she didn't. And this has just finished her off.
All right, back to matters in the Commons, Jack. There are 3 by-elections coming, including the big one, that is Makerfield. That will be held. I think they're all occurring on the same day. That's the 18th of June, so not far away, fortnight from today. I was talking to a mate in London who sort of opined that Andy Burnham, the high-profile mayor of Greater Manchester, will return to Westminster because of fairly low voter turnout in by-elections. That makes a little bit of sense. As we discussed last week, he's the sort of tepid favourite to win the seat. But, of course, matters in the UK took a pretty ugly turn yesterday, Jack, or overnight over the over Tuesday to Wednesday, when a white boy was accused of racially vilifying a Sikh fellow. And the Sikh fellow has stabbed him, but the police came along and made the arrest of this fellow while he was suffering from stab wounds, or at least one stab wound. And
3.
he was claiming, "3 is it? I can't breathe, etc. Just put your. I've been stabbed. No, mate, you're all right." All that sort of stuff. Really awful, Jack, and plays into this sort of Tommy Robinson stuff. The two-tier policing and all that sort of stuff. Really, it will make the environment around these by-elections and the critical one in Makerfield. It just sort of blows some fire into that might suit reform, Jack.
Well, the video of this incident, the police
awful.
body camera, is a hard watch.
Yeah, it is. It's just awful.
There is a bit of a problem in UK policing in the sense that I think they got a couple of bad reports right through the years. The Lawrence report, etc., saying that they were not treating black and minority ethnic groups fairly, and so they rewrote their Office of Policing, their College of Policing guidelines, etc. And I think they've kind of got it wrong.
Bent over backwards.
Yeah, they've gotten not so much gone too far, but they've just got their instructions wrong, and that's led to this sort of thing happening, or being more likely to happen. It's entirely possible this was just an error by 3 or 4 particular police people, but there is enough of a pattern about this sort of stuff happening that, and it's dreadful for the trust of the community. This sort of stuff, it's just devastating,
and it plays into the hands of people like Robinson, who are just awful human beings. But look, it's been a fairly tough week for police. I don't know if you've seen the Four Corners episode examining New South Wales police, Jack, but there were some absolutely shocking stories there too. Bashings in custody, false arrests, and disturbingly, one police officer who had bashed a 15-year-old had thrown his body cam footage in the harbour. There were two undercover police officers, again, accused of a very, very savage assault, and they were ultimately let go from the force, and both were jailed. And of course, it's very, very different now, the New South Wales Police Force. And let me start by saying I've got a fair bit of time for those guys who work in those special squads. But back in the the armed robbery squads and the gang squads and those sorts of things, organised crime. Back in the 80s, of course, it was completely different. The general duties officers were battling to get through their day and generally doing a reasonable job of things, while you had these special squads were just bereft of, were just utterly, filled with systemic corruption. But nowadays, it's more the general duties officers than those special squads who are, presumably, do have highly professional investigators working for them. That's a complete difference. And I think also, too, it's worthwhile telling our listeners while we look at this that there are some command areas that are worse than others. And that indicates that you've got poor leadership at the top, where general duties officers might think they can get away with these things, while in other command areas, they won't. I do recommend.
That's almost impossible to eradicate it. What you can do is minimise it.
Well, we talk about Victoria Police. Victoria Police has got a fairly storied history in terms of corrupt issues arising from time to time. The problem with Victorian policing, Jack, is they're just so hopelessly under-resourced. I heard a story. It's perhaps anecdotal. I don't know how true it was, but 2 divisional vans for something like 80,000 people in the outer east of Melbourne. So they've got some problems there, but they're not of the corruption variety. They're of the resourcing variety. Tough work being a police officer, and even tougher still being a good police officer. But the good ones we should be hanging on to. All right. I do recommend the Four Corners episode to our listeners. If you haven't seen it yet, it's all up there for iView. If you want to have a look at it, pretty disturbing footage on occasions, and certainly illustrative of a bit of a broken culture in some parts of general policing in the state. Over now to our special topic for the episode, and that's the COVID pandemic. Now, Jack, one thing you prepared this document, and thank you for that, but we need to understand fully before we even start an analysis, just how serious COVID was, because I think there's been a perception there that it was, not as bad as we thought it would be, and perhaps government overreached, overreacted, went too far and all those sorts of things. So it's worthwhile just going through what we understand about the consequences of the pandemic. Officially, there are only 7 million people who died of COVID. And that's from 2020 to 2026. But many countries stopped testing, including, virtually everyone you can think of stopped testing. And many other countries did not provide documents on cause of death to the World Health Organization. So we don't really we can only estimate it, but we can estimate the effect of COVID to an extent by looking at excess mortality across the world, and that takes us up to a figure, and this is a big difference between the lowest estimate and the highest estimate. It's between 22 million and 69 million deaths between 2020 and up to essentially up to the present. So that's significant. If we take that high end one, that is a higher casualty rate or fatality rate or mortality rate, I should say, than the Spanish influenza. So I think the first thing to say is that this was a very serious thing in the first place, and it continues to have consequences across the world. There are 400 million people, around 6% of the global population, with long COVID or have experienced long COVID or continue to experience long COVID. And the more we're seeing now too is that COVID infection, especially the second infection, I was reading a study recently saying the second infection can be worse and can have long-term health problems. So COVID, unlike influenzas, unlike the influenza pandemics and the epidemics that we've had, long COVID has significant consequences to an individual's health going forward. We're seeing higher rates of cardiovascular disease. We're seeing type 2 diabetes rates skyrocketing, and it's like, some studies are indicating that COVID infection may be a result of that, and of course accelerated dementia. Limited number of studies there, but showing us there's one Chinese one, very small study, but people of a certain age who did not have dementia had COVID, were infected with COVID, and we're talking about people in their 70s, 80s, etc., but developed dementia as a result of that COVID infection. So it's a very serious sort of thing. Long COVID in Australia alone, because there's issues around diagnosis and difficulties in diagnosis, we've got a range between 200 and 500,000 people who have experienced or continue to experience long COVID. So the first thing to say is very, very serious pandemic. We don't want to underscore that. And also one of the things, unlike an influenza epidemics and going all the way back to the Spanish influenza pandemic 100 years ago, this has continuing problems going forward for public health services and individuals, of course, who are afflicted with these chronic illnesses as a result of COVID infection. So that's where we have a starting point. And I just wanted to make that clear because I think one of the hangovers of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, is that we thought it was sort of inconsequential compared to what, the original reports as it came across the world in January, February of 2020.
Certainly in most of the world, it's viewed as being over.
Yeah, and I think that's a real mistake to be made there. And now, of course, public health notices come out saying, look, it used to be influenza season, Jack, here. Now it's influenza and COVID-19 season. So COVID-19 is with us and will be with us for a very, very long time. And again, there are, we're continuing to see higher rates of excess deaths in Australia, excess deaths in most countries, like most countries around the world. So it is a very serious pandemic, and I think that's part of the problem that we sort of underestimated. If you look at the raw figures, it's only 7 million people across the world compared to some 50 million in the Spanish influenza pandemic. But I think when you dig down a little bit, you see some really big problems and some major challenges for our public health systems across the world and in Australia in particular. But then we get to government responses. Now,
one of the reasons why people think it's gone is because
government just stopped counting.
Well, all they're counting. I mean, the only figure that really matters is the excess deaths figures, because all of the other figures are kind of made up. Because they've all got different methods of attributing to COVID, et cetera, none of them very reliable. But governments seem to have a collective embarrassment as to how they dealt with this. So they want the whole thing to be just put into the history books.
Yeah. And I think that's a really grave mistake in terms of public trust as well. That we don't want to be morbid, but people should be constantly reminded of the dangers of COVID. And as I say, the sort of COVID infection, particularly among elderly people, but across the community too. When you start looking at the rates of childhood COVID infection, Jack, and the long-term health issues around that too. So in the United States, for example, Bobby Kennedy Jr. and his wisdom, or lack thereof, took children people under the age of under 18 off, some government-supported COVID vaccines, and that's a really bad move too. We're seeing more and more kids who've been infected get higher rates of long-term illness. So we've had. We've talked about this country's obsession with royal commissions, but we really should have had one, I think, in respect of the COVID-19 epidemic in Australia. We, like we did in the Spanish influenza pandemic, we had relatively low rates of mortality. But there are still some issues there. There are a number of mistakes made. So why didn't we have a Royal Commission into this, Jack? Is it because politicians were trying to feather their own nests or protect their reputations?
Nobody, not just politicians. I don't think the politicians, the public health officials, and a good part of the media wanted to have their actions and their judgments put through scrutiny.
What do you mean the media? Tell me what you mean by that.
Well, I don't think with a few exceptions, the media was very unquestioning of the judgment of the public health officials and the government through the COVID period.
Bear in mind, Jack, we've just gone through the figures. I mean, I've heard the counter arguments to what they did, and I'm happy to acknowledge that there were some really silly things done, like we talked about curfews, for example. And curfews are really just about providing law enforcement with the best possible environment they can to work in. And that was why it was done, and it should have been acknowledged as that and really cut down. I mean, you've got an example there of people going to the beach, or the beaches were closed and all this sort of stuff, and it was quite ridiculous. Although we did see, while there was a major outbreak in Western Sydney, people but the wealthy and well-to-do were having a swim en masse at Bondi, while working class or battlers in Western Sydney were treated very, very poorly by comparison.
Yeah.
So there were some really big mistakes made. I think Victoria's obsession with community infections at zero was a nonsense, and they should have opened up much, much earlier. But Jack, you've got to also remember when this thing first happened, and there was a year really where there were no known treatments, there were no vaccines available. Really, the first AstraZeneca vaccine was administered in, I think, November of 2020 to an elderly chap. He was still around when I interviewed him, probably 2023. Not sure that he is now. He was well into his 90s. But so there was, we have to really try and take us back to to that particular point in time. No treatment, no vaccines available. And we had a viral infection that could be airborne at least for a short period of time, and could be airborne and infect people who were within a metre or two away of you. So this is pretty serious stuff, isn't it? And that's what public health officials and governments were confronted with.
Just before we leave the media, I watched a lot of the Victorian State Premier, the man in the North Face jacket, standing in front of the media talking about this. There were only two journalists I ever saw ask him pertinent questions about why he was doing something. There was Rachel Baxendale from your newspaper, from Australia.
And Lee Sales, I think.
And Lee Sales. Nobody else asked a question.
Yeah, look, I mean, those daily conferences that Andrews has, this is the other part. Try and understand the historical context. He was immensely popular at the time.
I know.
Jack.
But as a journalist, your job ought to be there to ask the pertinent questions. Because
what would have been your pertinent questions?
Well, you would have been asking, why about the curfew? Why about arresting people for being on the beach? Why are we having such a disparate effect on people? The laptop class, the public servants, they can work at home. They're actually making extra money from working at home, whereas the person who runs a cafe or is a tradie or whatever can't go to work. They're going broke. Why aren't we thinking about all of that? No one asked those questions.
Well, of course, we did it. We had the delivery class, if you like. There were people who made a living from delivering food to people's homes and those sorts of things. There certainly were excesses made, and certainly when we get into 2022, those excesses they seem even more excessive, didn't they? There were problems with our vaccine rollout. Let's deal with that. We had opted in for the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was the non-mRNA vaccine and the first available. And our government under Greg Hunt and Scott Morrison, they got this horribly wrong, didn't they, Jack?
I think they probably did.
Well, they opted for the AstraZeneca, and then it transpired that AstraZeneca could, in a very rare number of cases, could cause some heart issues. and that tended to be in people, I think, men particularly between the age of 40 and 49. And my memory of that is that 7 people died from those heart conditions as a result of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And they didn't take AstraZeneca off the market, but it was pretty clear that's the government, that is. It was pretty clear that this is not the preferred vaccine. Of course, medical people, they're great problem solvers, so they were able to identify these particular pericarditis, of course. They were able to identify these problems and deal with them. So, that death rate closed and AstraZeneca wasn't handed out to 40-year-old men, those sorts of things. But then we had a long wait for our Pfizer et al. mRNA vaccines, Jack. So we'd opted in, we'd thrown all our hat into one ring, but not into others, and that became a problem too. What was kind of good is that over 95% of Australians above the age of 18 went and got their vaccines. And once we were vaccinated, there were a couple of other things that occurred. Then we might remember that the Omicron variety arose in South Africa, and we could see what was happening in South Africa with very, very low mortality rates. So the Omicron variant actually was more infectious but less lethal, and that and the vaccine seemed to break the back of the pandemic.
Yes.
What this has caused, Jack, there've been plenty of anti-vaxxers and those sorts of nutters around the place. But what this has done is basically create a lot of mistrust of government. And I think that's something that we still are dealing with, even if we talk about the rise of One Nation. I think some of those pandemic management issues are still alive in the community in terms of perception of government overreach.
Well, firstly, the government shouldn't have outsourced so much of the decision-making to public health officials. Public health officials have got a job to do. That's to advise the government of what they think can happen. But always government decisions are political in this sense, in that they have to balance competing interests. And the government didn't really do that. The governments didn't really do that.
It's a bold move, though, Jack. I know what you're saying, but it's a bold move for a government, for political leadership with no scientific background, for the most part, most of them lawyers, etc., to make calls on public health issues that would be contrary to public health advice. That would be a really big thing. I mean, we did see Gladys Berejiklian do this, and as I said, we had a very small group of people in Western Sydney who were locked down, couldn't work, while everyone else was sort of going about their duties. One thing, a lot of people say in hindsight, we should just let it go. We should have just, not had the public health measures, people could distance perhaps, wear a mask, those sorts of things, but just let it rip. And that would have been absolutely devastating. And we saw that in the United States. The three countries with the highest mortality rate for COVID, Jack, do you remember?
Oh, no, I don't.
Oh, they were all sort of led by populist governments. So United States, even though Trump, did a lot to get the vaccine rolled out, there was really no mandating or not mandating in many states. So the United States had not the highest, they had the second highest. Brazil had the highest and India third. Populist governments that basically said, let's just let it rip. And so that would have been a failure. So I guess when we're looking in the rearview mirror on this sort of stuff, we need to understand that, yes, there was overreach. Yes, in some cases that overreach was about efficiency for law enforcement rather than any other public need. That one of the big mistakes, I think, Australia made, the federal government in particular made, was that Scott Morrison, and this has not really been touched on at all, Scott Morrison would not allow ADF quarantine facilities to be used for people coming into the country. And then we just saw people being dragged off to hotels where they were quarantined there, where you can see a little gap under the door, and it's not an efficient way of doing things. We do have greater quarantine facilities here, and Morrison may have thought that the quarantine facilities that we had in 2020, let's say, were inadequate, but he refused, or the state governments were not allowed to use ADF quarantine facilities. We're using them now for people coming back who may have been infected with Ebola. But COVID, no. It was, I don't know if you remember the Victorian thing they had, one of the Victorian episodes of transporting people from airport to hotels with plastic bags over their heads. Jack, do you remember that?
No, I don't.
It was, rubbish bags, the old, the dark green rubbish bags over their heads, because that was considered a good means of infection control. So, the recommendations of this inquiry, Jack, create a proper Australian CDC, much greater transparency, release expert advice publicly, better national planning with clear political accountability, rebuild trust through honesty about uncertainties and costs. Politicians must own the big decisions on freedom. These are your recommendations, basically, I gather. Is that correct?
No,
Jack?
they're the inquiry recommendations.
Okay, I know. That's what I thought. And then I thought it was so in lockstep with your comments that I thought these might have been you editorialising. Politicians must own the big decisions on freedoms and spending instead of hiding behind experts. The inquiry largely validates the public frustration many Australians felt. There is one thing we can take to the bank is that there will be another pandemic at some point. And if it is a pneumonic, that is, respiratory, like COVID, with airborne viruses and these sorts of things, you'll have sort of similar circumstances coming to this country and all around the world in a not too distant future. So how best do we handle that, Jack? Do we close the country down again as we did the first thing? I think that was a disaster too. Not using the quarantine facilities we had, and then basically shutting down the country, to the extent where we had, people come into the country by the thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands.
Yes.
Caused all sorts of economic problems there and then. Unemployment, Jack, it was at 7.5% in 2020, halfway through there. But by the end of the pandemic, it was 3.5. Not a bad result in the end, but the 4% differentiation, that's hundreds of thousands of jobs.
Yes, indeed.
And a lot of those jobs, well, we might remember, why was the arts community left out of job seeker and job keeper rises, Jack?
I don't know.
Is that because Scott Morrison didn't like the arts community, wanted them all on wheelbarrows being carted out to the morgue? It was an odd thing, wasn't it? Because arts people, they tend to be also working in casual employment very often, and that was going to be denied, and often in the hospitality business, so that was going to be denied them as well. So it left certain sectors of the community just behind.
There were a lot of sectors of the community were left behind, and there were some sectors of the community who did rather well out of lockdown.
Well, I think Bunnings did pretty well out of it, didn't they, Jack?
And honestly,
just keep the JobKeeper that you didn't hand out to your employees.
And if you're able to work at home and get your full salary, well, the actuaries would say that you're 15% better off.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not sure
the cost of going to work is about 15%. So they're going to say if you could get your full salary and working from the spare room,
your full salary. The JobKeeper was $600 a week.
No. There were people who were working from home who were getting their full salary and making 15% extra effectively.
Well, that's one of the consequences of the pandemic, isn't it? And we're seeing this now. You and I were talking about medical appointments and how many of them are now done by telephone, video calls, these sorts of things now. And of course there is this, this greater push for people to work from home where they possibly can, and it became an election issue with the opposition rather foolishly. Saying they wouldn't support it among Commonwealth public servants in Canberra. They later qualified. And it was one of the contributing factors to them getting an absolute hiding, Jack. Because people want these things, young mothers, etc. They can have the kids around, or they can do their parenting, they can do their shopping, they can do everything in a sort of reasonable time frame because all of a sudden they don't have to spend 2 hours a day on the train.
I've got to tell you, we had a lot of working from home here in Hong Kong, and it was not popular at all. As a friend of mine put it, he and his wife are both lawyers, right? Live in a delightful 900 square foot flat, them, the 2 kids, and a foreign domestic helper. So he says, you're trying to do Zoom calls, basically 4 of you around the dining table. The kids are doing school lessons, and we're both trying to do Zoom calls. This was not good.
Well, you mentioned the apartment being fairly large, but it's still an apartment. I mean,
no, 900 square foot is large by Hong Kong terms. No Aussie's going to think it's very large at all,
But at the same time, while I think of that, Jack, I do remember, there was a dreadful episode around public housing in, I think, Flemington, in Melbourne, Flemington, North Melbourne, with the public high-rising towers being shut down, etc.
Yes.
There was one family there that I remember. They were African emigres, and a single mother with 9 kids in a housing commission 2-bedroom flat, which means you're not going to get a lot of living area there too, and they were stuck there.
Yes. What happened with the schools? That really was disgraceful.
Well, again, Jack, we talk about these things, and I know what you're saying, but again, when we start looking at COVID infection in the youth and the long term, the greater likelihood of long-term health consequences affecting these kids, you've also got the teachers who could be infected. It was considered for a very long time, and it may even still be if we listen to Bobby Kennedy Jr., and we shouldn't, felt that children were vectors for COVID-19, but they wouldn't suffer any considerable harm from COVID infection, or wouldn't be infected in some cases. That was the theory. But the more we see kids who get COVID infection in their developmental years can go on, are more likely to have chronic conditions and significant health issues going forward.
Well, talk to somebody who works in child psychology in Australia, and they'll tell you.
Well, here's another thing. You said that there'd be higher rates of cancer because people wouldn't be able to get along to their medical appointments, and of course that was one of the exemptions for getting around, going to medical. Now, I looked at cancer rates, Jack, and cancer rates are not significantly higher. Cancer death rates, mortality rates, and diagnosis rates are not significantly higher
than they were
during the pandemic. No, not really. We're talking about 68,000 mortality from cancer in the UK, which is pretty much the same. It's gone up to 71. since the pandemic. I had a look at this before. So we're not talking about significant hikes there, Jack, but that was one of the things. So, I mean, we can do the stuff in the review, but at the time, you were saying, there'll be higher rates of cancer because people won't be diagnosed in time because they're locked down. And it hasn't really manifested that way. So what should we do at the next pneumonic pandemic hits the country, Jack, or hits the world? What should we be doing?
Well, it probably won't happen for a while, so we'll take no notice of what happened in COVID, and they'll make some of the same mistakes.
That's what we shouldn't be doing, right?
But that's what will happen.
Yeah, I know. What we need is...
You ask me what will happen, I'm saying...
I know. And you're right, it will happen that way, but what should we do? So we need... quarantine facilities. You might remember state governments were all of a sudden starting to build quarantine places left, right, and centre.
Yeah, some
a lot
family
of them got knocked over. A lot of them just didn't eventuate.
Some family in Queensland cashed in big time. They built
built one on their property. Yeah, that's right. But we do have new quarantine facilities in Queensland, Victoria, New South Wales. So we need to open these up. We don't really want to close the country down because you suffer economically. I mean, those spiral effects, you're going to suffer economically anyway in a pandemic. But if you haven't got people to pick your food and slaughter your cattle, you're not going to get a lot of food into people.
And the lockdowns, not just in Australia but around the world. A city like Shanghai lost a whole generation of expats who, having lived through the fairly extreme lockdowns in Shanghai,
they were fairly extreme,
have left, and they will never go back.
But at the same time, if you've got, let's say, similar sorts of airborne type infections, what do you do? I mean, you can't have people crowding in buses and trains and those sorts of things going to work.
What you could do better would be a lot more open with the Australian people, and you could have government do what government's got to do, which is to weigh the pros and cons of everything and do it as transparently as possible.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up this. I just want to talk briefly about vaccines because when we're talking about One Nation, they've got Malcolm Roberts, Senator Malcolm Roberts, who we call on the Conditional Release Program Teeny Weeny. He maintains that some 70,000 Australians died of the vaccine, and there's just no support of this. And what he's done, like a lot of anti-vaxxers have done, is look at excess deaths and consign that to the vaccine injury, which is clearly fake. In fact, the more that we're seeing from the mRNA vaccines is that the technology, if not the vaccine itself, is actually driving lower rates of cancer, and mRNA is being used as treatment methods for a wide range of cancers, including bowel and pancreas. So, Jack, I guess what we're talking about is we've learned nothing. We've got to have learned nothing, but we're not going to apply anything that we have learned into the next pandemic. And we're probably, as a group, as a community, less trusting than we were of government beforehand. So when we do have the next pandemic, people are going to say, not this time.
Well, it depends how soon it happens. If it happens with this generation, governments will have a problem because they have destroyed the trust. If it doesn't happen for 50 years or so, that won't be quite so damaging.
What about Western Australia, Jack? They literally locked their state down, and they had negligible. If they had one COVID death, I'd be surprised, but they might have had a handful, but it'll be no more. And that was given this very isolated state in the first place, that was proved pretty effective and was incredibly popular, Jack.
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember they played the AFL Grand Final.
He was called the state dad.
Yeah,
the Premier.
But he won in 2020 with the majority of by the length of the straight. I think they reduced the Libs to two lower house seats, and thumped them all. So a lot of that was happening sort of pre-pandemic, and I guess there was a major impact from the pandemic, but maybe it's just a Western Australian thing. But I got the impression they actually love being isolated.
They probably do, and in their it's a peculiar place. Provided the iron ore and LNG ships can come in and out, they can earn their money without having to do any real trade or commerce with anybody else, right? So it suits being isolated, provided you can pop the Margaret River wines into a box and send them somewhere, and the iron ore and the coal, etc., gets somewhere. You can still make some money. So the lockdowns didn't really adversely affect them economically. And if you live over there, you are used to living in the most isolated part of the Western world.
It's basically celebrated. The isolation is celebrated. Look, we'll sort of wrap this up by saying, yes, COVID is and remains a major public health issue. And people should not ignore their vaccines as we come into this sort of flu and COVID-19 issue. Obviously, we don't have a pandemic anymore, but we have COVID here, which it's definitely worse than your run-of-the-mill influenza, because there is this higher likelihood of ongoing health problems. And then we've got governments who need to be a little bit bolder about how we keep things moving. We shut down the country, Jack. I'll just finish by saying this: our response to the Spanish flu pandemic in 2021 was almost the same as it was in the pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic 100 years later. There were barneys over lockdowns. There were police arresting people for not having their hankies over their faces, and these sorts of things caused a fair bit of civil alarm. And what happened then, Jack, was that the recently created Federal Department of Health, I think it was created around 1913, was given by the states and territories the authority to oversee pandemic management for the Spanish influenza outbreaks, as Australian servicemen were coming back from World War One, and then the first moment there was a shit fight between the states, everything just fell apart, and the whole thing fell apart. It was very, very similar. It's like 100 years later, we really didn't learn very much at all here. So I guess my last point would be, or my last question to you is, when you have something like this, you need things to be centralised. You need directions from politicians and bureaucrats to be centralised. You can't have one state doing one thing and another doing it another.
The three countries you group together as having populist governments have another characteristic, and a much more important characteristic in this situation, is that they are all federations, if you like. They have limited power of central government. The emperor's a long way and the mountains are high, and that applies to a number of countries. That just because the president of India decides to do something, it doesn't, in Uttar Pradesh, it mightn't carry much weight at all.
I still think the fact that three populist leaders led. I mean, what happened in Brazil was nothing short of outrageous. I think probably the worst one was Peru, Jack, where the Peruvians the health minister resigned, but the Peruvians decided, and they are the winners in terms of the highest rate of the absolute highest rate of mortality. They started giving the people of Peru hydroxychloroquine as a preventative, but no vaccine. And it led to a much higher rate of death. All right, moving on. We hope.
My final word on this is: I don't think there's any appetite at all for a proper inquiry and learning your lessons of it at all. I don't think anybody wants this to happen.
No, but it's still a major. I still think it's a major. It still has a major impact on how the community thinks and acts politically, economically, and otherwise. I think there are a lot of people still bruised and battered by this. There are a number of people who are very, very sick, of course. But a lot of people who were locked out or wouldn't consent to vaccine mandates and so forth. I mean, vaccine mandates in themselves, it's a really tricky thing politically. I think the best way to do this is just to say, here's a vaccine, it's effective, it has a very, very low rate of vaccine injury, but in order for us to get back to a pre-pandemic state, get our economy rolling, get our communities together, go and get vaccinated. And it was, the media, you talked about the media continued to run these figures where people would sort of, I better go and get my vaccine. And we got up to 95%. And I think mandates wouldn't have changed that at all.
Can I tell you how suddenly it all ended here? I'd actually been under a house arrest because I'd had to go to hospital for a catheter procedure, and they said, "You're still positive for COVID," and I said, "Well, I'm over it, and I'm testing negative. The unit at the hospital tests are more sensitive, so they got you in there." So I said, "What? Do we put it back another week?" He says, No, we're not worried about it, but we've got to report you to the government." And I said, "Well, for God's sake, make sure I'm not sent out to Penny's Bay for a week in a container."
You would have loved it, Jack.
So the bloke comes
around
around
the road from Disneyland, mate.
Yeah. So the bloke comes around with his wristband and puts it on me. I open the door, he puts it on me. He says, "You're not allowed to leave the flat for 7 days or whatever." And it's at the end. And two things: I couldn't find out what day it actually ended, and I was obliged to go for a vaccine, but because I was under house arrest, I was a day late. And in one of the big sports centres down on the waterfront, just down below us here, they turned it into a huge big vaccine centre, right? And at this stage, the Chinese government had packed up and said, "This has never happened. There was never any COVID," right? And it was all over. So I go down there and I'm 24 hours late and the whole thing's gone. There's kids playing racquetball and stuff in there, and the whole thing's been packed up and left, right? And no one could tell me where I was supposed to go or whether I was supposed to get one. It was just over in a second, right?
That was it.
That was it.
When did you get vaccinated?
I didn't.
You didn't?
No. This was vaccine number 3 or 4 or whatever it was.
Right, okay.
Yeah. But there was an obligation to go and get your booster and all. But once it was finished here, it was just finished. That was it. The whole thing was gone.
Yeah, and I think that was the sort of global response. It's just draw a line under all this and just move on. And I think part of the problem is that we're not going to learn how to make these things a little bit better. But of course, you've got a whole raft of things, potentially through COVID or indeed something else that's new and horrible that comes our way, and we just can't see how we could probably do that better because we haven't learned, and we haven't learned since the Spanish influenza pandemic. All right, moving on. We are very, very late for sport, Jack, so we'll get through it as quickly as we can. Choosing a new coach. Essendon and Carlton will have to go through this. Both have interim coaches in place. How should they go about it? Carlton, I've got a committee which includes the CEO, the president, and I think the head of football. I think there's 3. I think there's 4 in that panel, and they'll interview people as they go forward.
Everyone's fallen in love with the process, and there's this technical process where you score certain things, and I've had it explained to me. And I'm always suspicious of attempts to make scientific that which is not scientific. And there's a fair bit of intuition and judgment as to who's the person who's the right fit for a job,
Let me ask you, is James Hurd the right bloke to be coaching Essendon, Jack?
My answer to that would be 17 other clubs probably wouldn't give him an interview.
Yep.
If he applied for their job, right? They may have backed themselves into a corner where the only way out is to appoint him and kind of get this over and done with. It'll either work or it won't work. But on a merit-based assessment, no, he's not. Rowan Connolly said, would you take him or John Longmire? Who's won a premiership, 5 grand finals, success rate in the 60%. Of course you would.
Yeah, well, you should. But whether that's going to keep the members and the spectators happy is another matter. So they're sort of, they've got to play to that audience as well. So it's very difficult. Carlton, of course, play the Bombers on Sunday night, I think. And we'll see how they go. Carlton, of course, have had this astonishing revival, just 3 wins in a row, so nothing to get too carried away about. But when we look at their stats analysis, Jack, they're in the top 1 or 2 in pretty much all the serious stats just in the last month, because they had a reasonable outing. Just got beaten by a couple of goals by Brisbane on the game that sort of precipitated the end of Michael Voss. In fact, he'd resigned beforehand. So, so they're actually travelling well, and you look at them and go, gee, what was going on there beforehand?
Patrick
they
Cripps
moved the
says,
ball beautifully now.
Patrick Cripps said, this is what we've been trying to do all year and we just couldn't get it off. And that may well be the case, but it really doesn't matter because Vossi had plenty of time. He didn't get it, he didn't make it happen, so someone else is going to be the beneficiary of that. That's how life works.
Just one stat, Jack. They were, I think, ranked 16th in the competition in getting the ball into their forward 50, and now they're number 2.
Yes. I mean, their game style is...
And it's different. It's different.
Yeah,
so their
game style is unrecognisable.
Oh, they used to just bomb the ball in. It was so frustrating. They used to just bomb the ball in. Now they're saying, okay, well, we don't have the big power forwards. We've got Harry McKay. We don't have Charlie Kerner. So we just want a contest, and we're going to kick the ball in. Patrick Cripps took the brilliant mark and kicked the goal to get Carlton over the line against Geelong. But the kick from Mitch McGovern, it was low and flat and hard and just didn't give defenders enough time. Brilliant Geelong give defenders enough time to get in and spoil it. So I think there's some significant improvements in their skills as well.
Which is a reminder, I think, that people keep talking about how bad this list is and that list.
See, I was convinced that they've listed. I mean, the other thing, Jack, about Carlton, they've got 7 players 21 or younger.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's list is as bad as people think it is when they're not playing well, right? Because they all get to draft really promising kids. Now, sometimes those kids are just flatlining; they're not getting any better because there's something else wrong at the club, the coaching or whatever, right? But once you get something positive in there happening, they'll often improve because the gap between the best list and the worst list isn't as big as people make it out to be.
Well, I think Carlton can look at these young guys. I mean, Jager Smith is now getting more time in the middle. Jack Eisen debuted under Josh Fraser. And some of the other younger ones have come back in. And I think if you're you're looking for sort of confidence, you can often get it. The older players will get it from just having these young guys around. Harry Dean, he's 18 years of age, mate. He looks like he's played 200 games of footy, and you can get a great deal of energy from these younger guys as they come through. All right, we'll leave the French Open for a week, Jack, but and we're only 2 weeks away from the World Cup. Have you seen who's playing? Is your money on Cape Verde to win?
I can't seem to see much interest in it. And I was talking to Scotland are going this year. Who isn't going,
Scotland,
basically.
That's right. Because it's gone from 32 to 48.
48, yeah. So I was talking to a Scottish mate, and he said, well, we're going, and we're going to the World Cup, Scotland. He said, if you told me that, 2 years ago that not I nor any of he's in his 30s, so none of his mates are going, right? And these guys are all doing pretty well. They'd be the first people on the plane, right? But it just isn't drawing the interest.
The ticket prices, because of FIFA adding another 16 teams to the World Cup. They need more money, obviously, but the ticket prices are extraordinary. Except in Mamdani's New York, where I think they've been a bit discounted for locals. But the ticket prices are way too expensive. You wouldn't be jumping out of your skin to go to Guadalajara and watch the soccer there, because that place virtually got blown up by cartels just a month or so ago.
By the way, New York, it's actually New Jersey where the stadium is. So
it is too. That's right. Yeah, that's where the final will be too. Yeah. And
have you ever been past that? It's the bleakest, most miserable looking joint you ever seen. I mean, you go past on the train on the Acela to Washington, and it's Meadowlands racetrack where they do the harness racing, all that kind of stuff, is right next door. It was built in the car park there. So there's this huge car park, not a single tree in this car park.
Sounds like Waverley, Jack.
Look, it does. It's kind of Waverley on steroids.
Arctic Park.
And it looks even more bleak than Waverley, right?
Yeah, look, I know there's going to be – Iran is playing. I thought they'd stepped out, but I think they're certainly in the fixtures. I had a look at this the other night. In fact, they play New Zealand first up. Australia plays who do we play first up? I just can't think of them. It's US, in fact. That's our first game up against.
No, we've got Turkey first and then the US, I think.
Is it the second game? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I
suppose they could market the Turkey game as sort of Gallipoli round 2 or something.
It's a bit much. But the other problem is, Jack, if you're lucky enough to win it, you're going to have to try and get Donald Trump off the podium, because when they had the club grand final last year, he wouldn't get off the stage. Including players just looking at him, he goes, "Can you fuck off, please?" Anyway, so that'll be another little travail for anyone who wins it. Who's favourite to win? England are in the sort of second or third line of betting. Brazil a little bit further down. Germany, of course, and Spain, I think, are the favourites.
Yeah, I think Spain are the favourites.
And there's a bit of a thought that it'll be quite warm, certainly in Mexico and in southern parts of the United States, and that some of the Spanish they all play in Europe anyway, but some of the Spanish players might be a little bit better accustomed to the heat. Anyway, we'll see how that all goes, not for a couple of weeks. Starting tonight, Jack, England, for those cricket lovers like myself, England v New Zealand, first test at Lord's, bit of rain around, I believe, so we'll have to wait about that. But the point I wanted to make, Jack, I just wanted to run through the NZ team. Their likely team is Latham, their skipper, Conway, Williamson, Ravindra, Mitchell, Blundell. And that's their first 7. The first 4 have made Test double centuries. In case of Williamson, about 5. Mitchell's made 190 against England. Blundell's made 180 in Tests. I reckon that's just about the best number. Well, it's best first 6 in Test cricket. it's certainly up there. Got some really, really good players in there, and because they'll either play Phillips or Satner. Satner to bowl his left arm spin and Phillips to bowl his medium seamers. And that allows them to have Smith, Jamieson, Henry, O'Rourke, 4 dedicated seamers, and in the case of O'Rourke, blindingly quick, and in the case of Henry, really, really good. That's a good test side, Jack. All righty. For those who love all things cricket, it's on tonight on Foxtel. Well, that takes us out. We're running a little bit late today. We apologise for that. I did get some reader stuff which we will deal with next week, including, Jack, an expose of who you are. Greg, one of our WA fans wanted to know, I guess, your resume, and we could do that very briefly next week too. But I thought we'd sort of covered this through, but Greg seemed not to know it. But anyway, we just want to. I want to thank you for your opinions today, Jack, and to our listeners, thanks for hanging in here for an extra 10 minutes of this particular podcast, and we'll be back next week. See you, folks.
Just
go
one
on.
thing
No, Jack's got something.
I just got a question. When we're talking about the who you are stuff, will I be giving evidence on oath?
I think if we just, I mean, look, it's a pretty simple thing. You know, you did your HSC at Assumption College, Kilmore. You became a carpenter for a while, just like our Lord and Saviour, and then you did your law degree at Melbourne University, and then you worked for Holding Redlick, I think. And then you became a litigation lawyer, and then you became an immigration lawyer.
Slater and Gordon as well.
Slater and Gordon, yes, I missed
worked
that
for
one.
2 of the big 3, yeah.
And then you became a litigation lawyer, and then you became an immigration lawyer, and then from there to the Refugee Review Tribunal. And that was more or less the end of your professional life there, I think. Isn't that about right?
My legal life, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So that's the Refugee Review Tribunal. You were a federal cabinet appointee, and you used to sit on matters that, to prevent them flooding into the courts and make determinations about whether refugees were genuine immigrants or not. I think that's about right. So that's the resume there, Jack. We don't have to get into anything deeper and uglier than that. But yes, that is who Hong Kong Jack is, a lawyer of considerable note. All right, folks, that's it for us. We've got to go now, and we'll talk to you next week. See ya.
Cheers.